Before the Civil War, female family members were the primary caregivers to the sick and wounded in North Carolina. A local doctor might be called upon in more severe cases. Overall, the state lacked an adequate hospital system to treat the huge numbers of the injured and ill that the war would bring.
Actually, the only hospitals that did exist were the two that were run by the federal government. They were merchant mariner hospitals, the marine hospitals at Portsmouth Island over towards Ocracoke, and down on the lower Cape Fear at the port city of Wilmington. The other hospital that existed was in Raleigh, but it was really designed for, it was established as the State Mental Asylum by Dorothea Dix.
The Confederate Medical Department was created in February 1861. It was patterned along the lines of the U.S. Army model.
Now, when we look at Civil War hospitals, it's important that we categorize them, and I like to say follow the money trail, because not all Civil War hospitals were funded and operated by the Confederate Army. Because of this misconception at the beginning of the conflict, and with thousands of soldiers sick and wounded, it was privately funded, privately operated organizations, like here in New Bern, the Ladies Soldiers Society here, would establish a private hospital. The funding for this hospital, the women would raise money. Local physicians, not in the Army, would come by and take care of the sick. Also filling this gap was Raleigh and the North Carolina Medical Department, who had its own Surgeon General, which did not answer to Richmond and to the Surgeon General of the Confederate Army. These hospitals, initially established by the state of North Carolina, were fully funded by North Carolina, with surgeons with governor's commissions. These initial hospitals North Carolina will fund is two in Petersburg, Virginia, and then one later on, along kind of working with the government in Richmond. Why? Because the vast majority of regiments formed early in the war went to Virginia to serve. Down here in North Carolina, those dozen or so regiments that remain in the state are primarily going to be focused in the coastal defenses of North Carolina, down around Wilmington, here in New Bern, Roanoke Island, Washington. Because of this large concentration of forces, there will be a need for hospitals. Now, the other third category of hospitals, which will become on later with the Confederate Army, managed by the Surgeon General, Samuel Preston Moore. By the spring and summer of '62, the Confederate government finally kind of gets this act together when it comes to the proper healthcare system for its soldiers. And you will see a lot of these early privately run hospitals, state-run hospitals, are turned over to the Confederate government. And now they technically belong to the Confederate Medical Department. And their funding will come from Richmond, from the Confederate Congress of appropriations to the War Department. So we have our three types: privately operated, state operated, and then I call government, but essentially Confederate Medical Department.
The CSA operated varying types of military hospitals. The facilities had differing sizes and purposes.
Now, when we look at those three categories, we now need to look to define the types of hospitals that will be. For example, here in New Bern, just to the immediate north up the river here, the Neuse River, about a mile or so, was the 7th North Carolina, where it was encamped initially in the war. Each regiment had its own surgeon, and they would establish what we would call a camp hospital. Camp hospitals are very temporary in nature because as the regiment moves, like the 7th North Carolina, will eventually relocate from here down to the Carolina City, Fort Macon, Morehead City area, down along the coast in Carteret County. That hospital will move with it. We also have in some of our larger garrison-type locations like Goldsboro and Wilmington and Raleigh, there will be a need for what is called a post hospital. Now, post hospitals serve those soldiers that serve in the Confederate Army, but let's say they're with the quartermaster department, the commissary department, the ordnance department. They don't have a regimental surgeon. They don't belong to a regiment. So where do they go when they wake up in the morning with a sore throat and a fever? Well, typically these larger garrison type operations would have a post hospital. And that's where they would go, probably several beds. And once, if the doctor that's assigned there determines that they need to move up to the next echelon of care, which is a general hospital, those soldiers would be transferred to. Now, the term general hospital, this is your much larger, like, for example, here in New Bern on Craven Street, the Branch General Hospital had 220 beds. It was multi-story high. Now, the term general means that anybody can go there. Whether you're from North Carolina, if you're in a Georgia regiment, Tennessee regiment, Virginia regiment, a general hospital by law is supposed to take you in and take care of you. So hence you start to see the term general hospital in these much larger hospitals. And by the end of the war, Richmond, for example, several of the general hospitals up there, we're talking 4,000 or 5,000 bed capacity. Here in North Carolina, our general hospitals never really get larger than about 400 to 500 bed capacity. The other types of hospitals you may have would be a field hospital. For example, out of New Bern in December of '62, General Foster's raid towards Goldsboro. He's going to fight at the Battle of Kinston, Whitehall, then ultimately along the Neuse River at the Battle of Goldsboro Bridge. Now, along the way, soldiers are going to get injured. They're going to become wounded. And there may be a need to occupy a private residence at that time. Just to use, for example, as the Army stops for the night, instead of setting up tents, why don't we take over Mr. Smith's house and put all our sick and wounded in there, and then we'll pick up and move back towards New Bern. So hence the term field hospital. Another type of hospital that you will see mentioned occasionally in the Civil War is more of a more temporary nature. And usually it's associated with some type of communicable disease like yellow fever or smallpox. You have these epidemics that break out. For example, down in Wilmington the summer of '62, and then even up here in New Bern, they had a yellow fever outbreak with the Union forces up here. Smallpox is another example. There's a need to quarantine these people away from the population. So hence, a town outside a private residence or building outside the town limits of New Bern or Wilmington may be occupied temporarily as a pest house or essentially a quarantine type. And of course, the other type of hospital, specialty wise, deals primarily with those free blacks and enslaved individuals that are impressed from their slaveholders to work for the Confederate government, work for the Confederate Army. And we see them digging trenches around Goldsboro, Fort Anderson, Fort Fisher, those kind of things. There's incumbent upon the Confederate Army to make sure that these individuals do not die of sickness, or the Confederate government is now liable for property loss to that enslaver. So typically down around Smithfield, the first one, and then in Wilmington, and then later on the war, there's some mention of possibly Goldsboro and even Salisbury, these Confederate Army Negro hospitals as they were officially designated. Another major kind of hospital, which is specific just to the Confederate Army, and we have several here in North Carolina, that was established in the spring and summer of '62, are wayside hospitals. Wayside hospitals, the whole concept was the ladies in South Carolina, for example, there's a lot of heavy fighting going on in Virginia, and there's a need to clear out, to make room in the hospitals up there, bed space. So they would furlough soldiers home back down to Georgia and South Carolina or to North Carolina, and for 30, 40 days. Then they'd come back to the Army. But in the meantime, these soldiers had to travel. They're transient in nature. And what the ladies in South Carolina discovered was you have these soldiers, passing through South Carolina on their way home to Georgia, but they're having to wait overnight at a rail depot in the middle of the winter with no food. They may have a bandage or dressing that needs to get redone, or they may catch a common cold along the way. And the ladies established these wayside hospitals. Now they're at the beginning, when they're first established, they're privately operated. Once again, private funds are running these. One of the first ones we have here are down in Wilmington, and over here in Charlotte, North Carolina, we have wayside hospitals that are established, as well as Salisbury, Raleigh. Now, eventually the Confederate government says, you know what, this is a good idea. And later in '62, the Confederate government will make it mandatory that wayside hospitals be established by the Confederate Army. So in the spring of '63, you see wayside hospitals that were formerly privately run that are now taken over by the Confederate government. A perfect example is the wayside over in Salisbury, North Carolina. It's taken over by the Confederate Army.
At the start of the war, the Confederate Army used existing structures as general hospitals. They were usually more permanent and often located near transportation centers. In North Carolina, the first general hospitals were in former maritime facilities on the coast at Wilmington and what is now Southport. A camp hospital in Raleigh, the center for the state's military operations, was soon converted to a general hospital as well.
Now up here in New Bern, where a number of forces are concentrated for the defenses in this region, the need for a general hospital occurs. And in September of '61, immediately behind my rear here, was the Sutham store. And the ladies, the Soldiers Society here, Aid Society here in New Bern, created a privately operated hospital in the generosity of Mr. Sutham, who gave up his building here on Hancock Street immediately to my rear. Now it's very small, hence the need later on, towards the end of the year in January '62, the need for the much larger Confederate General Hospital located back there on Craven Street. By January of 1862, the number of Confederate forces stationed along the coast of North Carolina, both at Wilmington and here in New Bern, required the establishment of additional general hospitals. Here in New Bern, immediately to my rear, is the Stephen Brick Block building that was leased by the Confederate Army from Mrs. Riggs, and it served as a second general hospital here in New Bern. Now this hospital will operate up through the Battle of New Bern in March of '62. Meanwhile, down in Wilmington, because of the number of forces, another larger general hospital was established as well. We also have general hospitals established in the town of Washington, North Carolina, just north of New Bern, up along the river. And down around Morehead City, in what was then called Carolina City, an additional general hospital is established.
In early 1862, Union General Ambrose Burnside launched an expedition against coastal targets in North Carolina, including the vital seaport of New Bern.
Now, at the time of the battle, Assistant Surgeon Thomas G. Martin, who had been laboring through the night to remove the sick to make room for potentially wounded men coming from the battle, he steps out and looks out and observes out the front door of the hospital here. He noticed along the railroad track here the 35th North Carolina and several of the local militia units all running to the north. Several blocks away from here is the railroad depot, where they hope to jump on a train and escape the Union capture of New Bern. Now, once the Federals occupy New Bern, they will not utilize the Noose General Hospital. Apparently it was just too small. A very small structure based upon the pictures we have of it. They did not utilize it, but they will utilize the larger general hospital over on Craven Street.
With the loss of the hospitals in New Bern, Washington, and other coastal locations, the North Carolina hospital system would spread along the railway lines to Goldsboro, Wilson, Weldon, and Raleigh, and westward toward High Point, Greensboro, and Charlotte. By December of 1863, North Carolina had established a network of care to treat its sick and wounded soldiers, and had become a major hospital center for the Army of Northern Virginia. Women and African Americans provided a significant portion of the care North Carolina's soldiers received during the Civil War.